Okay. First of all, again, Arik said this before, but it is worth noting. Please extend a round of applause of gratitude to not just Arik, but also all of the students that made this a pretty damn well organized conference. So thank you very much. So having listened to everyone and all the outstanding presentations for the last 2 days, I have 6 quick thoughts, in terms of conclusions that I think are worth saying. And then Chris is going to rip and explain why, probably half of them are wrong. Yeah. So the first thought, and this isn't so much a conclusion, but it's something that I don't think really said that needs to be pointed out. No one thought we were going to be here. It's worth remembering that all of the sanctions that were imposed in February of 2022, this was an unusual situation. First, that the West knew that an attack was coming, which is usually unusual in the instance of economic sanctions. But the other thing that the intelligence community got badly wrong was the assumption that the war would last maybe a month. And so I think one of the things we always forget is that a lot of the measures that were imposed were going to be imposed with the thought that eventually this war would end. And the fact is, we're now 31 months in, and that hasn't happened. So as a result, I don't think part of the reason that we are where we are is that I don't think anyone necessarily had the foresight of what the global economy and what the global political economy would look like, when you impose sanctions for this long. The second takeaway I have, and God knows I would love to just yell at this at everyone in Washington, is that there are some hard limits on what economic statecraft can accomplish. A lot of the conversation here is about, oh, well, what if we had done things absolutely, more stringently, more severe sanctions in February? But, I think that even Eddie, who I think is an extremely enthusiastic promoter of sanctions, acknowledges that it probably wouldn't have changed the outcome, in the sense of it probably wouldn't have caused the Russian economy to collapse. Russia still would have been in Ukraine. And the fact is, again, expecting that sanctions against, between great powers is going to stop one country from invading another, by and large, is putting way too much stock in what economic state. My third takeaway is that very often, in terms of what we've seen with respect to economic warfare, the key things about it are as much political as they are economic. One of the important takeaways, and I think one of the things that's legitimately surprised Russia, was the fact that the European Union was on board with sanctions from day one. That was clearly something they were not expecting. And even if the sanctions didn't devastate the Russian economy, I think it actually fundamentally destroyed what Vladimir Putin's primary strategic goal has been for the 25 years he's been in power, which is to split the transatlantic relationship. And if anything, he's managed to do the reverse of that. Another thing that we haven't mentioned during this conference, but is worth pointing out, has been the role that the Gaza conflict has played in terms of the sanctions on Ukraine. Because up until October 7th, the United States could have made an argument for why members of the global South and others that had basically been sitting on the fence should have joined in terms of the sanctions, because of what Russia had done was in many ways unprecedented. Israel's response to the horrific attacks by Hamas, however, highlighted and essentially enabled Russia to engage in a much more vigorous, robust form of whataboutism that I think, essentially stopped dead in its tracks the idea of the global South in any way participating more vigorously with respect to sanctions. The fifth takeaway I have is be very, very wary of overgeneralization. One of the things that U.S. policymakers have a tendency to do is latch on to the lessons from the last big case of sanctions. And I think one of the things that went into what happened in terms of sanctioning Russia was the belief that because they had worked so well in the case of Iran, both in terms of creating JCPOA and then second, in terms of really damaging the Iranian economy after 2018, I think there were wildly exaggerated expectations of what sanctions could do on Russia. And then finally, and this is a really sober conclusion, if this war ever ends, the great unwinding for Russia is going to be fantastically difficult, and I am deeply worried about how this is going to play out, because Russia essentially, to be able to prosecute this war, and this is partially about the sanctions, it's also partially about the fact that the war has gone on for 30 months. Russia has turned itself into a war economy. It's booming as a result of that, but it's booming because its military industrial complex is, being shoveled as much capital as possible. The interesting and disturbing question to ask is that if we ever get into a situation where there's peace, how will the Russian economy react to that? What will happen as the defense sector has to wind down at some point? And we start seeing, understandably, Russians will demand more consumer goods. The question is, to what extent will the Russian economy be able to cope with both the credit bubble that it's creating, but also the radical shifts in the composition of its GDP that it'll have to adjust to if the war ever ends? I think I'll close on that.
I think you got at least half of the statements wrong, Dan. So
Yeah, we
rush to correct it. Okay. So I thought one of the most clever phrases of the conference was from Professor Tretsky, who described economic sanctions as the worst possible foreign policy tool, except for all of the others.
Mhm.
And I enjoyed the chance to think through over the course of our panels. Well, suppose you hadn't been using sanctions, you used something else, but you've gotten a better result. And I think it's understandable why the Biden administration removed active military tools from the table. I think if you were to envision, well, suppose you use diplomatic leverage against Russia, what result would that have had? Probably not much. And so on the one hand, I think we've illustrated the many challenges that sanctions have faced in terms of achieving the results. On the other hand, I'm not sure any other policies have achieved better results if you had the same set of goals, which is perhaps a sobering conclusion, but I think that stood out to me from many of the panels. The second one, we do agree, Dan, about the economic fog of war, the fog of economic war, probably a better way to put it. And even looking back over the past now 2.5 years, there's still a lot of really fundamental questions that I don't think we know the answer to with any confidence. For example, we had the debate earlier this morning of, well, what would have happened if the U.S. had done more to sanction Russian oil early on in the conference? Would Russia have produced less or not? Fundamentally important question, a question that deterred the Biden administration from going tougher on sanctions, and we don't know the answer. And we probably will never know the answer with any certainty. I doubt there's a document deep in the Kremlin archives that says, if they do X, we do Y. And I'm struck by the fact that if you look back to the historiography of World War I and ask, what was the role of British embargoes on the German decision to leave World War I? There's immense debate among historians, despite the fact that all of the archives are open and there's no more information that's hidden behind classification. We still don't agree what the result was. And I think that speaks to the challenge of making decisions when there's these fundamental uncertainties and disagreements that hang over you. And there are uncertainties not about the small questions, there are uncertainties about the big questions that make it very hard to assess. I thought the third question that I wish we'd had more time to dig into, and perhaps our error in setting the agenda, but which was really brought out in the last panel, was the rest of the world. We've of course talked about Russia in the West in our conference title, but the rest of the world really matters. We talked about India as a major buyer of Russian oil over the past 2.5 years. We've heard the phrase the global South mentioned. I wish we had more time to dig into who these people are. Who is the global South exactly? And I'm sort of struck by the Henry Kissinger quote about Europe. When I want to speak to the global South, who do I call? You call India versus China versus Indonesia. You get very different answers, I think, on many of these key questions. And I suspect there's a lot of interesting work to be done analyzing the views of different countries that one might group as part of the global South as their views the war. The other group that I think we could have spoken more about are the group of countries that border Russia. Central Asia, of course, very important. A bit about the conflicts yesterday, but a lot of these countries had their political economies transformed by an influx of Russians, by an influx of money, by trade diversion, by new questions about the uranium industries.
Also, I would add in ways that they didn't expect.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so I think that in some ways that there have been profound effects on the Western-Russian relationship, but actually potentially even more profound effects on countries that have been impacted by the relationship and have had less leeway to devise their own response. They're smaller in scale. And so when we hold this conference again in 2 years or in 5 years and reassess what we've learned since then, I guess those are the questions that I'll be interested to ask again. I'm not sure we're going to have profoundly better answers given the fog of economic war that I think we're dealing with.
Yeah, I have to say the most depressing thing I heard at this conference was something that Eddie said at the morning panel, which was, and he acknowledged this when talking about what U.S. policymakers were doing when they were formulating the sanctions in January and February 2022, saying we seldom articulate clear goals for sanctions. So, as someone who's written about this for 25 years, that's a touch depressing to think about. But also, unfortunately, not entirely unsurprising. And in some ways, again, one of the ways in which this was an unusual case was precisely that U.S. policymakers knew this was coming months down the road. Very often when we talk about economic sanctions and economic statecraft, it's often in reactive rather than.
Well, I guess that clarifies why political scientists have such vehement disagreement about whether sanctions achieve their goals.
Yeah.
Hard to assess if there are no clear goals.
And I think
There you go. Let's change
yeah.
halfway through.
No,
that.
that's the other thing. One of the other, I mean, I've written about this, but obviously partly what's going on is the goals shifted over time. Clearly, in the case of the war in Ukraine, sanctions were obviously designed to deter. In the fall of 2021, they failed at that. Then they were designed to coerce in February and March of 2022. They failed at that. And now this is clearly a goal of, containment / economic warfare. And, I think at best the results have been mixed there. But on the other hand, Russia also anticipated a lot of things that they would be able to do with economic statecraft. And I think this is also a case where they were surprised by how Europe responded, by how global energy.
But I guess that underscores, I think, one of the interesting facets of great power economic warfare, in contrast to small power economic warfare, which is that you inevitably intersect with more facets of the economy and therefore require more types of expertise. I think we've had the benefit of bringing in people with real energy expertise, for example, in this conversation, real financial markets expertise. We haven't even begun to touch on agriculture, or we spoke uranium very briefly, or metals, which are a fascinating aspect as well. And I think if you put yourself in the shoes of policymakers who are trying to make decisions in still a pretty compressed period of time, their ability to tap into the types of expertise you would want is extraordinarily limited.
That would be the other thing that was my takeaway. When I say overgeneralize, it's not just learning from the wrong cases. It's also the case that even when you're talking about within a case, sanctioning one sector as opposed to sanctioning another.
Yeah.
The industrial organization of the sector, the global supply chains of whatever sector we're talking about, are in many cases so different that the sanctions will obviously have very different challenges.
And so it's turning to where we are today going forward. You've argued that one of the key facets of the current period of economic warfare is that it's actually disseminating throughout every sector of the world economy and every type of economic relationship. And I guess one of the interesting efforts that was made pre-2022 was to learn from 2014. Russians tried to learn, the US tried to learn, you could debate the efficacy of learning. But now it seems everyone is trying to learn. Everyone's trying to learn. I'm struck by the number of countries that are trying actively to insert themselves into nodes that they think will be critical in the future. They give themselves leverage. Debate whether to work or not, but the extent to which key governments think this is a worthwhile use of their time does strike me as somewhat new.
That's correct. And also it ties into something that I think Maria Grinberg's work, is particularly important here, which suggests that particularly if you're in an ongoing conflict, there are limits to what states are willing to do in terms of practicing economic. There will always be carve-outs, there will always be exceptions. And one of the interesting things about the global political economy going forward is that as much as people like say, oh, it's bifurcating or it's going to be polycentric, I think one of the other things we have to acknowledge is that there is a greater degree of constancy, perhaps, than we might otherwise expect, ranging from Russia still selling oil and gas to Europe because it remains in both of their interests to do so. But also that one of the ways we might see this emerge is, the idea that China and the United States are going to reduce bilateral trade. Sure, but that's meaningless if all you're seeing is just an increase in trade through Bangladesh, or trade through Vietnam, or trade through Mexico, or trade through Morocco. And I think, one of the interesting things going forward is that there's going to be a lot of really bad discourse about decoupling and de-risking and all of that. And I cannot stress how dumb much of it's going to be.
For live analysis, follow his Twitter feed.
Yeah. But nonetheless, the question of what is observable on the surface and what is actually going on fundamentally in the economy. And one of the things I will be intrigued by, and one of the things that worries me, is that great powers are going to misperceive the degree or have actually gone through with this, and then escalate some other conflict and realize that it's not this.
So I think there are two sets of empirical questions that I would love to have answered in every industry for every product category, which is impossible, but nevertheless, that's my aspiration. One is elasticities of demand and supply. And two is interconnections between different types of products. There's a tiny number of supply chains where you have any level of visibility into this. But actually this is like in Europe, the key debate in 2022 was what's the elasticity demand for gas. And there was and the smartest economists in Europe lined up on both sides, and they produced models that had wildly different answers. And there was a little bit at stake as to who was right. And if we can't get it right for natural gas, a commodity, and they're very big at that, the likely to get it right for gallium, I think is unfortunately lower, but nevertheless pretty important.
I think in some ways that's the meta takeaway from this whole conference, which is we've exposed the radical limits of our understanding. Even, global supply chains, global economic relationships, and as much as we think we know, if there isn't, a shock on par with what happens in terms of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, I am reasonably confident that there will be at least 5 major externalities that we know.
Well, on that note, setting a research agenda for all of us.
Yes.
Thank you all so much for joining us for the last 2 days. I certainly learned a lot.
Yeah.
Thank you to all the speakers for enlightening us. And I think this is an agenda of further research.
Yeah.
For the future.
So hopefully we will have you back here maybe next year, maybe the year after, where maybe we will be slightly less uncertain. Thank you very much.
Everyone.
Oh, look.